said it on a Thursday morning in late September, standing at the edge of her father's wheat field with his hat in his hands and the autumn light coming down gold across everything, and he hadn't meant it the way it landed. You know, Delia said it quietly, almost to himself, a woman like Vera deserves a man who actually sees what she's worth. He expected nothing. A nod, maybe. A polite sound of agreement from her father standing beside him. Instead, from behind them both, from the direction of the barn where she had been carrying feed and had apparently stopped, came a voice so steady it almost hid what was underneath it. She said, "I've been waiting a long time for someone to be that man." Neither of them turned around immediately. The wind moved through the wheat. A crow lifted from the fence line and didn't come back. And Jonah Hale stood with his hat in his hands and understood that something had just been said that could not be unsaid, and that he did not want it to be. Vera Colston was 27 years old and had lived her whole life on the eastern edge of Harwick County, Montana. The ranch her grandfather had built sat at the base of a long ridge that caught the first light of morning and the last of the evening, which meant the days there were longer than anywhere else she'd known, or at least felt that way. Her father, Edmund Colston, ran cattle on the lower pastures and wheat on the upper 40. He was a careful man who measured things before he cut them and didn't speak until he was sure of what he meant to say, and Vera had inherited this from him more than she'd inherited the color of her eyes or the way she moved through a room, which was quietly and with purpose. Her mother had died when Vera was 11. She didn't talk about this often, not because it still broke her open, though sometimes it did, but because she had learned early that grief that is performed loses something. She kept hers private and put it to use. She learned to cook from her mother's handwritten cards, learned to keep accounts from watching her father do it wrong for 2 years and then asking if she could try. She ran the house the way her mother would have wanted it run, not out of obligation, but out of love for the woman who was gone. And that difference was visible to anyone who spent enough time there to look. Jonah Hale had come to Harwick County 4 years earlier. He'd bought the homestead parcel 2 miles east of the Colston place from a family named Pruitt, who'd given up on Montana and gone back to Ohio. The land was not in good shape when he took it. The house needed work, the fences were down in 3 places, and the well had gone shallow. None of this seemed to discourage him. He was 29 when he arrived and 33 now, and he had turned that neglected parcel into something that a man could be proud of. Not because he talked about it, but because he simply showed up every day and did what needed doing. Vera had known him for all 4 of those years. He attended the same church, bought supplies at the same dry goods store, came to the same community gatherings. They had spoken dozens of times. He had borrowed tools from her father twice and returned them cleaner than he'd found them. She had fed him supper once when he helped Edmund repair a section of roof after a spring hail, and had noticed that he ate without calling attention to himself and thanked her afterward with the kind of sincerity that didn't feel rehearsed. She had thought of him. She would not pretend otherwise, at least not to herself. She had thought of him more than she thought of most people, which she recognized as information she did not know what to do with. What she did not know was that he had been thinking about her too, in the way that slow people think about things they aren't ready to admit yet. Not ready because readiness takes time, and Jonah Hale was a man who did not move until he was certain of his footing. The wheat came in well that September. Edmund had put in more than usual, and the yield was good, better than the 2 years before, and he had asked Jonah to help with the final days of harvest because his hired hand had taken sick and the window was closing. Jonah came without hesitation. He worked the long days without complaint and ate his noon meal with the Colstons on the porch and didn't stay longer than was useful, which Edmund appreciated in a neighbor and said so directly. It was on the 3rd day of this that Vera came out to the field at mid-morning with water and found the 2 men at the fence line talking about drainage. She handed them each a tin cup and stood for a moment looking at the cut wheat lying in long, even rows across the hillside. There was something about a finished field, she had always thought. The work already done, the land opened up, the smell of it. She went back without interrupting, but she had been close enough to hear the beginning of their conversation shift. to hear her father say something about the county and the drought risk next year, and to hear Jonah answer in that considered way he had, where he thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he did. She did not look back, but she was aware without wanting to be that he watched her go. The social supper at the Harwick Grange happened on the second Friday of October every year without fail. It was the kind of gathering that a small county depended on, a chance to take stock of things before winter came down. Who had done well? Who needed help? What the season had cost, and what it had given. There was food on long tables and a fiddle player named Orrin Sales, who was better than he looked and worse than he thought, and it didn't matter because nobody came for the music. Vera came with her father. She wore a dark green dress that had been her mother's and that she had taken in and lengthened over the years until it was hers in all but origin. Edmund told her she looked fine, which from him meant what it said. Jonah was already there when they arrived. He was standing with a group of ranchers near the door, listening more than talking, which was his way. He looked up when the Colstons came in and nodded once to Edmund and then to Vera, and she nodded back, and that was the whole of it. Later, a woman named Bertie Sawyer, who had been Vera's nearest neighbor in friendship for the last decade and who had absolutely no patience for indirectness, appeared at her elbow with a cup of cider and a particular expression. "You know he's been watching you all evening," Bertie said. "I don't know what you mean," Vera said. Bertie looked at her with the long patience of a woman who has heard this specific kind of answer before. "Vera," she said, "I have known you since you were 16 years old. You know exactly what I mean." Vera looked at the room. Jonah was on the far side of it, talking to Edmund now and not, in fact, looking at her at all in that precise moment. But she understood what Bertie meant. She had felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Something in the air that the instruments haven't measured yet. "He's a good man," Vera said, and didn't say anything else. Bertie looked at her for a moment. "That's not the same as saying you haven't thought about it?" Vera drank her cider. "No," she said, "it isn't." She walked home that night with her father on the dark road, the stars enormous above them the way they only were in October when the air had gone dry and clean. Edmund didn't ask her what she was thinking. He rarely did, but near the gate he said, out of nowhere it seemed, "Jonah Hale is a decent man." "I've always thought so." Vera said, "I know you have, Papa." He said, "That's all. Just saying." She looked at him in the dark, and he was already opening the gate, and she followed him inside, and neither of them said anything more about it. But she lay awake that night longer than usual. October worked the way it does in Montana, which is with urgency. The days shortened fast, the temperature dropped and came back up and dropped again further, like something testing how much it could take before it committed. There was firewood to put up, and the garden to put to bed, and 100 other preparations that winter demanded in advance. Jonah appeared at the Colston place on a Tuesday morning to return a post-hole digger he'd borrowed in August. He could have left it at the fence. He didn't. He came to the door and knocked, and when Vera answered, he held it out and said, "I meant to return this sooner." She said, "Edmund's out at the east pasture." He said, "I know. I saw him on the way in." She understood then that he hadn't come to return it to Edmund. She stepped back from the door and said, "There's coffee on." He came inside and sat at the kitchen table, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him, and they talked. Not about anything extraordinary. The post-harvest, the price of hay, whether the winter would be hard or mild, and what the signs said. But there was something in the ordinary conversation that was not ordinary, a quality of attention that she noticed and did not comment on. He asked her after a while whether she found the winters long. She thought about it genuinely. "Not as long as they used to feel," she said. "When I was young and my mother was gone, the first winter was very long. But I've learned to use them." He looked at her. "What do you do with them?" she told him. She read. She taught herself small things: how to repair a clock, how to bind a book, how to identify the birds that stayed through the cold. She cooked things she didn't have time for in the working seasons. She wrote letters to her mother's sister in Oregon. He listened to all of this. He didn't offer opinions about it or tell her what he did instead. He just listened and asked one or two questions, the kind that meant he was paying attention and not just waiting for his turn. When he stood to go, he held his hat in both hands and said, "I appreciate the coffee." She said, "Anytime, Jonah." He nodded. He went to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "You're not easy to know, Vera, but it's worth trying." She didn't answer. He didn't wait for one. He went out, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands around her cup and thought about that for a long time. He came back the following Tuesday. She wasn't surprised. She had put a second cup out. They talked longer this time, an hour at least. He told her about the homestead when he'd bought it, the condition it had been in, and why he'd bought it anyway. She asked him what he'd seen in it that made him think it was worth the work. He said, "The ridge behind it catches the morning light. I stood there the first time I walked the property and thought I could look at that every day for the rest of my life." She said, "That's a good reason." He looked at her with something careful in his expression, like a man who has something more to say and isn't sure yet if it's time. Then he said, "I've found a few others since." She let that sit where he put it. She was learning his language. He didn't ornament things. He put them plainly and let you decide what to do with them. A neighbor woman named Hetty Pinder, who was 71 and had a tongue like a weather vane that always pointed at the truth, passed Vera at the dry goods counter one afternoon and said without preamble, "That Hale man asks after you every time I see him in town." Vera said, "Does he?" Hetty said, "Don't be coy. It doesn't suit you." Vera smiled. "What does he ask?" "Just how you are," Hetty said, "how your father is, whether things went well with the harvest. He doesn't make a production of it. He just asks, like he's checking on something that matters to him." Vera paid for her flour and said, "He's a thoughtful neighbor." Hetty picked up her basket and said, "Vera Colston, I have watched you since you were in braids and you were doing that thing where you name something small so you don't have to say the larger thing out loud." She walked away before Vera could answer, which was probably intentional. The last Tuesday in October, Jonah came while it was snowing. Not heavily, just the first thin snow of the season. The kind that doesn't stick but makes the air smell like iron and makes everything feel quieter. Vera was at the kitchen window watching it when she heard his horse. She had the door open before he reached the porch. He stopped on the top step and looked at her. He looked surprised, not at the open door, but at something else, something he seemed to be working out. She said, "Come inside. It's cold." He came in. He sat. She poured coffee and sat across from him, and the snow came down lightly outside the window, and neither of them spoke for a moment, which was a different kind of silence than usual. Charged somehow, like the air before lightning. He set his cup down. He looked at her with the full attention he usually distributed more carefully. And then he said it, the way people say things that are true before their better judgment has time to weigh in. He said, "You know, Vera, a woman like you deserves a man who actually sees what she's worth." He said it as an honest observation, the way you might say the sky is a certain color or the wheat came in well. He said it and waited for her to agree in some general way and for the moment to pass. Instead, she went still. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him, and her expression was not one he had seen before, something that was open and decided and afraid all at the same time, the three things at once. She said, very quietly, "I've been waiting a long time for someone to be that man." The snow outside didn't stop. The fire in the stove made its small sound. Jonah Hale sat across the table from Vera Colston and understood with a clarity that startled him that she was not speaking in generalities. He said her name, Vera. She said, "Don't say you didn't mean it." He said, "I did mean it." He said, "I did mean it. I mean it completely." She said, "I know you do. That's why I said what I said." He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. He said, I have been trying to find the right way to say something to you for a considerable amount of time, and I have apparently just done it completely by accident." There was the smallest pause, and then she laughed. A real one. The kind that comes when relief and humor arrive at the same moment. And it changed her face into something he thought he would like to see every day for the rest of his life. She said, "You're not wrong." "I knew before you did." He said, "How long?" She looked at him steadily. "Long enough," she said, "that I would prefer you not ask me to be specific." He laughed too then, and the laughter moved through both of them and settled, and afterward the room was different. Not smaller, not larger, just more itself somehow. More honest. He said, "May I speak to your father?" She picked up her cup. "He'll be back by 4, she said. Edmund Colston came back by 4 and found Jonah Hale on the porch waiting for him, which told him something. He sat down in the other chair and looked at the last of the late autumn light going down behind the ridge and said nothing for a moment. Jonah said, "I'd like to come calling on Vera, with your permission." Edmund said, "What's taken you this long?" Jonah said, "I wanted to be sure." Edmund looked at him. "And are you?" "Yes, sir," Jonah said. "I am." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's not an easy woman to be sure about quickly. She doesn't show you everything at once. She makes you earn it." "I know," Jonah said. Edmund looked at him for a long moment, the assessing look of a man who has thought about this more than he has let on. Then he said, "Good. Come for supper Thursday. And come prepared to talk about more than fence posts." Jonah came Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and most of the Sundays between. What Vera discovered over those weeks was something she had suspected and now confirmed. He was, as she had thought, a man of few unnecessary words. But the words he did use were worth listening to. He had opinions, formed from experience rather than convention, and he offered them without forcing them on anyone. He found things funny in a dry, unhurried way that she had not expected. He listened to her the way she had always wanted to be listened to, not waiting for his turn, but actually following her somewhere. On a Sunday in November, he arrived, and instead of coming inside, went to the side of the house and spent an hour repairing the woodshed door that had been sticking since September. He did not mention it. She watched from the window and felt something move through her that she recognized after a moment as certainty, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that settles in without announcement and just stays. Her friend Bertie came to visit that week, and Vera told her, not everything, but enough. Bertie sat across the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup and said, "So are you happy?" Vera thought about it honestly. "I think I'm becoming it," she said. "It's different than I expected." Bertie said, "What did you expect?" Vera said, "I expected it to feel like something arriving. It feels more like something I already had that I finally gave permission to exist." Bertie looked at her for a moment. "That's the best thing I've heard you say in 10 years, she said. Jonah asked her in December. There was no elaborate setting. They were walking back from checking on a heifer she'd been concerned about. The cold, sharp in the sky, the particular dark blue it goes before the last light fails. And he stopped walking and she stopped because he had, and he turned to her and said it plainly. He said, "Vera, I know I came to Harwick County looking for land that was worth the work." He paused. "I found that. But I also found something I wasn't looking for and didn't know I needed, and I've been thinking about very little else for a considerable amount of time." He held out his hand. On his palm was a ring, a small thing, silver with a stone that caught the last of the blue light. He said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life learning how to be the man you deserved all along, if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Then she said, "You're already most of the way there. Is that a yes?" She took the ring from his palm. "That is most certainly a yes," she said. He put it on her finger there, in the cold blue field with the heifer watching from 20 yards away with the mild indifference of cattle. Vera looked at the ring for a moment and then looked at him, and there in the going dark, she felt the full weight of what had been given and what had been received and understood. That she would think about this moment for the rest of her life. They were married in March, when the snow was still on the high ground, but the lower fields had gone soft and the first things were coming up at the edges of things the way they always do in Montana, tentatively, testing the air. Half of Harwick County came. Bertie stood up with Vera. Edmund walked her down the aisle of the small church, and his voice when he gave her away was steady, mostly. Jonah waited for her at the front of the church, with his hair combed and his good jacket on, and an expression that she would describe afterward to Bertie as the look of a man who has just realized he is exactly where he is supposed to be. They said their vows quietly, for each other and not for the room. Reverend Aldous kept it short. Orrin Sales played the fiddle afterward. That evening in the homestead that was now both of theirs, Vera stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the ridge behind the house, the one Jonah had told her about, the one that caught the morning light. She had seen it in the evening a dozen times by now, and it was beautiful. She thought about what it would look like in the morning, and understood that she would see it every morning from now on, and that this was a thing she had not fully absorbed until this moment. Behind her, Jonah said her name. She turned. He was standing at the table with 2 cups of coffee, which he had made without being asked because he had noticed over the months that she drank coffee in the evening when she was thinking through something, which he paid attention to because he paid attention to her. She crossed the room and took the cup. Their hands touched briefly, naturally, the way they did now. She said, "You told me once that you bought this place because the ridge catches the morning light." He said, "That's right." She said, "You were thinking about that before you knew I would be here to see it with you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was thinking about the right things before I knew what I was thinking about." She looked at him. She thought about the year she had spent in that kitchen 2 miles east, reading and learning small things and writing letters to her mother's sister and waiting, though she hadn't known she was waiting, for something that was already 2 miles away working on a fence. They spent the winter there, the first of many. The days were long and good and hard in the ways that mattered. The ridge caught the morning light exactly as he had said it would. She watched it on the cold, clear mornings with her coffee in her hands and thought about what it costs to move toward the things you actually want and what it costs more to wait. Their first spring was wet and good for the fields. The second autumn their daughter was born, a girl they named after Vera's mother, small and fierce and entirely her own. The third year they put in more wheat, and it came in well, and Edmund came over for the harvest and sat on the porch in the evening and looked at the ridge going gold in the last light and said nothing, which from him was everything. On a Thursday in the autumn of their 5th year, Jonah was out at the east fence when Vera came across the field with their daughter walking beside her and a basket of water and bread. The girl ran ahead. Jonah lifted her up. Vera reached them and stood in the autumn sun and felt the years of it, all the ordinary days that had added up to this field and this man and this child and this life she had made with someone who had seen her clearly from the beginning, only slower than she would have liked, which she had forgiven him for entirely. She said, "You remember what you said." That first morning I answered the door in the snow. He said, "I remember." She said, "You said I deserved someone who saw what I was worth." He said, "I meant it then." She said, "I meant it then." She said, "I know. And you were right." He looked at her. "I was talking about someone else at the time," he said. "I hadn't quite gotten there yet." She smiled. The same smile she had always had, the small one that was entirely genuine and had nowhere to hide. "No," she said. "But you got there." He kept his eyes on her. And was it worth the wait? She considered it, the daughter on his shoulders, grabbing his hair, the wheat in long rows across the hillside, the ridge behind the house that caught the morning light the same way every day without fail. "Yes," she said simply. "It was. That is what patience looks like when it isn't passive. It is not standing still and enduring. It is continuing to become someone worth finding day by day in the hopes that the right person will eventually look up from whatever they've been doing and see you clearly." Vera did that for years. She didn't do it for Jonah. She did it because it was who she was, and because she was exactly herself. He eventually could not look away. The things in this life worth having are rarely hidden. They're usually 2 miles down the road, repairing a fence, trying to find the courage to say what they've been thinking for a considerable amount of time. Don't do what Jonah did and take 4 years to knock on the door. The coffee will always be on.